The early morning sun poured like liquid gold through the towering windows of the airport terminal. Everything shimmered, floors freshly polished, soft chatter echoing between steel beams, and the rhythmic murmur of boarding announcements cutting through the air like a metronome. Amid the bustle, two young boys walked with quiet confidence, their footsteps measured, their gazes steady. Elijah Thompson, 17, tall and broad-shouldered for his age, moved like someone raised to know the weight of his name. He wore a tailored navy jacket, simple dark jeans, and a quiet seriousness that made heads turn without knowing why. Beside him, his younger brother Micah, just 14, was all vibrant energy. He carried a backpack with one strap slung carelessly over his shoulder, his curls bouncing as he walked, eyes scanning everything with the unfiltered curiosity of someone still marveling at the world. They weren't loud. They didn't draw attention on purpose. But they didn't hide either. Flight 3096 to New York City, now boarding first class and Group 1 passengers. The announcement came over the speakers, crisp and formal. Elijah looked down at his phone to double-check the time. 7:24 a.m., right on schedule. "Ready?" he asked without turning. Micah grinned. "Born ready." Then more softly, "You think they'll have hot chocolate on board?" Elijah chuckled under his breath. "Probably not in first class, bro. But you can ask." They stepped into the line for first class. Their tickets had been scanned earlier at the kiosk. Non-refundable, non-transferable, printed on thick stock with the unmistakable insignia of Harrington International Airways in Boston gold. A gift of sorts from their father, Leon Thompson, CEO of the very airline they were flying. It wasn't meant to be an indulgence. Their father wasn't one for showy rewards. This was about pride and recognition, about celebrating their straight-A report cards and the way they had handled themselves with dignity and responsibility in a world that often expected less from boys like them. "You carry our name, boys," Leon had said a week earlier, resting a heavy hand on each of their shoulders. "So carry it well." And they had, right until the moment they handed over their boarding passes to the agent at the gate and stepped onto the jet bridge leading into Flight 3096. The cabin was hushed, elegant, soft leather seats, fresh-cut orchids in glass vases near the bulkhead, in the kind of silence that only money can buy. Elijah led Micah to their seats, 2A and 2B, on the left side of the plane. Windows wide, aisle clear, everything preset with linen-covered trays, noise-canceling headphones, and a neatly folded blanket atop each seat. Micah ran a thumb over the blanket. "Fancy," he whispered, a smile tugging at his lips. Elijah sat down, placing his backpack carefully under the seat in front of him. He pulled out a slim paperback novel and began flipping to where he had left off. Micah, meanwhile, pulled out a small sketchbook, his current obsession, and began sketching the nose of the plane visible through the window. They looked like they belonged, and they did, but not everyone agreed. From the front galley, Veronica Steele, the lead flight attendant with 2 decades of experience and a no-nonsense reputation, scanned the cabin with sharp eyes. She had seen all kinds of passengers in her time: celebrities, diplomats, regular travelers with irregular demands. But what she hadn't grown used to, what she never quite masked behind her polished exterior, were moments that didn't fit her expectations. And 2 young black boys, unsupervised, sitting confidently in the plush seats of first class, did not fit. She paused, gathering her skirt with one hand as she approached. A smile played on her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she said, her tone honeyed but edged. "Are you certain these are your assigned seats?" Elijah looked up calmly. "Yes, ma'am. 2A and 2B. First class." Veronica tilted her head. "And your parents, are they joining you later?" Micah, startled, glanced at his brother. Elijah didn't flinch. "We're traveling alone today," Elijah replied smoothly, reaching into his pocket and producing the boarding passes. "Here's proof." She took the passes, scrutinized them for longer than necessary, her eyes narrowing just slightly at the names printed at the top. Thompson. There was no mistake. The tickets were valid. More than valid. They were priority-level status. But Veronica didn't move. Instead, she offered a rehearsed smile and said, "I'll be right back," before turning briskly and heading up the aisle toward the cockpit. Elijah exhaled through his nose slowly. That was weird. Micah stopped sketching. Why'd she ask for our parents? Elijah didn't answer at first. He looked out the window, watching the slow crawl of luggage carts on the tarmac. Then quietly he said, because some people only think we belong here if someone white walks in behind us. Micah blinked. That's dumb. It is, Elijah agreed, but it's also real. They waited. Around them, other first-class passengers avoided eye contact. Some pretended to be engrossed in newspapers. Others had that strained, deliberate stillness that comes when people try not to involve themselves. Then footsteps returned. 2 sets. Veronica had brought Jackson Lee, her second-in-command, with her. He was younger, with an unreadable expression, but his body language said enough. Shoulders tense, lips pressed in a line. Veronica's voice was firmer now. Gentlemen, I'm afraid we'll need to reassign your seats. There may have been an error. Elijah straightened. There is no error. We have our boarding passes. Jackson stepped forward. It's just a precaution, boys. Please gather your things. There it was. The shift. From boys with names to boys as problems. Micah looked up at Elijah, uncertain. Elijah clenched his jaw but nodded slightly. They stood. Not because they agreed, but because they were smart enough to pick their battles. For now. As they moved down the aisle, heads turned. Passengers watched with varying degrees of interest, discomfort, or silent complicity. A woman in 3D shifted awkwardly. A businessman in 4A cleared his throat but said nothing. Micah whispered, Are we in trouble? Elijah glanced down at his brother, voice level. No, but they might be. The waiting area just beyond the aircraft door was cool and sterile, a narrow jet bridge flooded with the artificial brightness of overhead LEDs. Elijah and Micah stood near the wall, their carry-ons resting at their feet, their backs straight but their spirits dented. Micah leaned against the paneling, arms crossed tightly, the sketchbook now closed and held firmly against his chest. Elijah remained still, his fingers lightly gripping his phone. Though the boarding passes still sat in his pocket, undeniable proof, they suddenly felt weightless against the heaviness settling in his chest. A low thrum echoed from deeper in the aircraft, the calm hum of luxury, and yet here they were, separated from it, like intruders in their own story. It wasn't just about the seats anymore. It was about something older, colder, and harder to name. Why do I feel like we're the ones who did something wrong? Micah murmured. Elijah didn't look at him, because they made it feel that way. Just then, a staff member from the ground crew stepped through the side door of the jet bridge. She wore a navy blazer with a silver name tag pinned to her lapel. Claire Morgan. Her heels clicked as she approached, pausing just a few steps from the boys. Are you two the Thompson brothers? She asked, a touch of concern softening her otherwise efficient demeanor. Yes, Elijah replied with a firm nod. Would you mind stepping aside with me for just a moment? Elijah hesitated, then gave a small nod and followed, Micah close behind. Claire led them to a quieter alcove just beside the adjoining maintenance door. There, she gently gestured for them to sit on 2 molded plastic chairs positioned against the wall. I understand there may have been a misunderstanding regarding your seats, she said carefully. Can I ask, were you booked in first class? Micah leaned forward, frustrated. We weren't just booked. We had printed boarding passes. We have already sat down. They told us to move without explaining why. Claire held up a hand gently. I'm not here to challenge you. I'm here because your name matched an internal alert. There's been communication. Elijah's phone buzzed once, then again. 2 messages lit up on the screen. Dad. What flight number are you on? Dad, stay put. I'm handling this. Elijah exhaled slowly, the tightness in his chest easing. Not because the situation was better, but because Leon Thompson was now involved. Everything okay? Claire asked, her eyes flicking to the phone. Elijah gave a measured nod. It will be. Back inside the aircraft, Veronica Steele moved methodically through the first-class cabin like nothing had happened. She tucked stray strands of hair behind her ear, adjusted tray tables, smoothed wrinkle-free blankets, and offered practiced smiles to the nearby passengers. She was back in control. or so she thought. She gave a quick nod to Jackson Lee, who stood discreetly near the cockpit entrance. They had done what they were supposed to, at least in her mind. The decision felt appropriate. Two minors alone claiming first class, without an adult in sight. It didn't sit right with her, not for reasons she would say aloud, but the feeling was there. Gut instinct, she told herself. That's all. The problem was, it hadn't been instinct. It had been the assumption, and it was about to unravel. In the cockpit, Captain Henry Marshall, a seasoned pilot known for his calm under pressure, was reviewing the flight log when the cockpit phone lit up. He answered briskly, "Captain Marshall." A voice on the other end, a low, composed male voice, cut through the background. "This is the executive office. I need immediate confirmation. Were two unaccompanied minors removed from first class without protocol review?" Henry's grip on the handset tightened. "Let me verify." "One moment." He pressed the call button in the cabin. "Ms. Steele," his voice echoed over the internal line, calm but unmistakably edged. "Report to the cockpit immediately." In row 2, a few passengers stirred, sensing something had shifted. Veronica approached the cockpit with rehearsed composure, smoothing her uniform before stepping inside. But the second she crossed the threshold, the energy changed. Captain Marshall didn't offer her a seat. "Two boys, Elijah and Micah Thompson," he said without preamble. "Tell me why they were moved." Veronica blinked, her spine straightening. "Captain, I wasn't aware they were minors traveling alone in first class. I acted in the interest of protocol." "Did you check the manifest?" She hesitated, just for a breath, but it was long enough. "No, but I reviewed their—" "You assumed," he interrupted sharply. "You didn't verify." Veronica's mouth went dry. "And now," the captain continued, "we've received a direct call from Leon Thompson's office." "Yes, that Leon Thompson, CEO of Harrington International Airways." Her knees nearly gave. Meanwhile, in the boarding area, Claire Morgan had just received a message on her company tablet. She looked up at the brothers with a shift in tone. Urgency, respect, something almost apologetic. "Boys," she said gently, "please remain seated. I believe this situation is being escalated." Micah looked at Elijah, who gave the tiniest knowing smile. "What did Dad say?" Micah asked quietly. Elijah handed him the phone. Micah read the message and grinned. "Dad, don't worry about anything. She's in serious trouble." Back in first class, tension spread like smoke. Passengers exchanged glances. A few whispered. One woman in the 3D looked toward the front galley with a furrowed brow. Another man in 4A adjusted his tie and murmured, "Unbelievable." The incident wasn't staying quiet, and for the first time in her 20-year career, Veronica Steele could feel the control slipping through her hands like sand. The walk back to the jet bridge felt longer than it should have. Veronica Steele, usually brisk and controlled, now found her every step weighted with an unfamiliar burden. Each sound, clicking heels, muted coughs, the hush of filtered air, seemed magnified. She paused before re-entering the cabin. One deep breath. She adjusted the hem of her uniform with mechanical precision, smoothed her shoulders, and plastered on the faintest ghost of a smile. But it was hollow. The truth, she realized, wasn't going anywhere. And the boys were still here. Elijah and Micah Thompson were already back in the cabin. Claire Morgan had escorted them with care, offering neither pity nor pretense, only quiet respect. And when they walked back down that narrow aisle past rows of silently watching faces, Elijah felt it. This was no longer about two seats in first class. It was about being seen. And now everyone was looking. As they returned to seats 2A and 2B, a silence rippled through the rows. A few passengers shifted. One older man cleared his throat, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Another, in the rear of first class, tilted her head ever so slightly, watching intently. Micah slid into his seat, arms crossed. Elijah remained standing, his face unreadable. Veronica approached. Her footsteps were deliberate, her voice carefully measured. "Gentlemen," she began, slightly stooping to meet their eye level, "I'd like to personally escort you back to your seats." Micah looked up from his sketchpad. "We're already back." Elijah didn't sit. He studied her, not with anger, but with the kind of sharp, quiet appraisal that made people fidget. "What changed?" Veronica stiffened. There was a miscommunication. Your miscommunication, Elijah corrected calmly. She blinked. The truth lodged itself like glass in her throat. Her hands, so used to holding trays and stabilizing turbulence, now trembled. Yes, she admitted, her voice low. Mine. Micah leaned forward, tone tinged with dry humor. So do you say sorry, or is there a special first-class word for that too? Veronica inhaled slowly. I apologize. I was wrong. I acted on assumption rather than fact. There it was, the apology. But it didn't land the way she'd hoped. Because apologies, real ones, carry humility, not rehearsed regret. From the aisle, Evelyn Rhodes, the youngest flight attendant on board, stood just out of sight, watching everything unfold. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with conviction. She had watched Veronica act, had seen the boys humiliated without cause. And now she was watching the slow crumble of someone who had once trained her. She leaned toward Jackson Lee and whispered, "She still thinks this ends with words." Jackson said nothing, but his silence said enough. At the front of the cabin, Captain Henry Marshall placed the handset back in its cradle. The call was over, but the tremor it left behind remained. He turned to his co-pilot. "We've got orders from above, high above. The incident's escalated to the executive suite. Thompson himself is monitoring." The co-pilot raised an eyebrow. "Leon Thompson?" Henry nodded grimly. "They didn't just move the wrong kids. They touched the CEO's family." Back at seat 2A, Elijah finally sat. Micah remained quiet, scribbling again. But this time his hands lacked the usual flow. The lines were tighter, angled. Veronica turned to leave, but Elijah's voice stopped her. "If you're going to say sorry," he said, not unkindly, "say it like you mean it. Not because someone made you." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Veronica turned back, her jaw clenched. "I didn't think two boys would be traveling alone in first class," she said, more to the air than to them. "I assumed you saw our skin before our names," Micah interrupted, not even looking up. She had no response. Elijah's gaze softened slightly, not with sympathy, but clarity. "We've heard that kind of story before. You know how many times we've been asked to prove we belong?" The cabin remained silent, and no one was pretending not to listen anymore. From 3D, the older woman who'd watched from the beginning now leaned slightly forward. In 4A, the businessman adjusted his collar, cleared his throat, and finally spoke. "Excuse me," he said to Veronica. "How many other passengers in first class did you ask to show their tickets today?" The question cut the silence like a blade. Veronica's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Just them," she said finally. A long pause. The businessman nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." Veronica retreated, hands trembling. She moved back to the galley like a ghost. There, behind the thin curtain, she stood gripping the metal counter, trying to breathe. But nothing came easy. Not now. Evelyn followed her in. "You okay?" she asked softly. "I don't need your concern," Veronica snapped. But Evelyn didn't move. "You need something, because you're about to become the face of what's wrong with this entire industry." Veronica stared at her. "I made a mistake." "You made a choice," Evelyn replied calmly, "and you doubled down on it in front of two boys who carry more grace in their silence than you did in your whole career." Meanwhile, Elijah received a final message from their father. "Dad, stay calm. She won't be the one who ends this flight differently. You will." He showed it to Micah. The younger boy smirked. "She's going to have the worst landing of her life," Micah muttered. "Let's hope it teaches her something," Elijah replied, eyes steady on the front. Outside the aircraft, the jet bridge buzzed with activity. Two men in tailored suits waited beside the glass gate, flanked by airport security. They weren't random corporate suits. They were Leon Thompson's men, waiting, watching, and everyone on board would know exactly who they were here for the moment the plane touched the ground. The landing gear locked into place with a quiet thud beneath the floor. From the cockpit, the calm voice of Captain Henry Marshall cut through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our final descent into New York. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables secured in their upright position. Thank you for flying with us." The message sounded routine. But for everyone in first class, nothing about this landing would be normal, especially not for Veronica Steele. She stood in the front galley, eyes glued to the curtained divide between her and the cabin, her hand gripping the edge of the service counter so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. She had performed hundreds of landings in her 20-year career, smiled through turbulence, comforted crying children, dealt with celebrities and CEOs. But she had never, not once, been the reason for an executive-level review team waiting at the jet bridge. And yet here she was, praying the hum of the engines would drown out the pounding in her chest. Meanwhile, in seats 2A and 2B, Elijah and Micah Thompson sat side by side, buckled in, silent. Micah was texting. His thumbs moved quickly across the screen, but his face was unreadable. Elijah leaned back with his hands laced across his lap, watching the clouds drift by just beyond the oval window. "So, do you think they'll make her apologize again? Like in front of Dad?" Micah asked without looking up. Elijah gave a small shrug. "Doesn't matter. The apology wasn't for us." Micah tilted his head. "Then who was it for?" "For the people watching," Elijah said quietly. "The ones who think they'd never do what she did." The wheels touched down with a gentle screech, and the plane rolled to a slow, steady stop at gate C-18. As the cabin lights flicked on, there was a collective breath, not of relief, but anticipation. Some passengers gathered their things robotically. Others stayed still, eyes darting discreetly toward the front of the plane, because they had heard, they had seen, and they all knew. Something happened on this flight, something no tray of champagne or cold towel service could smooth over. The chime sounded. "Cabin crew, doors to arrival and cross-check." Veronica swallowed. Her heart felt like a stone lodged behind her ribs. She turned to face Jackson Lee, who stood just behind her, arms crossed. "They're here, aren't they?" she asked, voice low. Jackson nodded slowly. "Two men in suits, airport security, plus someone else." "Someone else?" He hesitated. "Leon Thompson himself. I saw him from the side window when we docked." Veronica's knees nearly buckled. It wasn't just a reprimand. It was an in-person reckoning. Back in first class, Micah sat up straighter as the jet bridge connected to the plane. Elijah glanced across the aisle. "Brace for impact." The moment the cabin door opened, the energy shifted. A uniformed ground officer stepped in first, tall, composed, earpiece visible. Behind him, in a charcoal gray suit and tie as sharp as the man himself, stood Leon Thompson. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just looked at the seats, at the passengers, and finally, at Veronica Steele. And every person in that cabin knew exactly who he was. Veronica stepped forward with trained professionalism. "Mr. Thompson, welcome." "Not necessary," he interrupted coolly. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the cabin like frost. "You already boarded this flight the moment you removed my sons from their seats." Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some bowed their heads. Others kept their eyes on him. Elijah and Micah stood slowly, collecting their bags. Not rushed, not afraid. They didn't need to look at their father. They already knew he was there for them. Leon turned slightly toward them. "You okay?" Elijah nodded. "We handled it." Micah added, "She tried to clean it up after." Leon's eyes sharpened, then settled back on Veronica. She stood motionless. "You didn't verify? You didn't check the manifest? You didn't consult your crew? You saw two black boys in first class and made a decision that cost this airline more than you can imagine." I didn't mean to offend," she managed to say, though her voice trembled. Leon's jaw tightened. "This isn't about offense. It's about assumption weaponized by authority." Behind him, Melissa Grant, Vice President of Human Resources, stepped forward and handed Veronica a sealed envelope. "Ms. Steele," she said, neutral and firm, "you are being relieved of duty effective immediately, pending a full review." Veronica's face paled. She took the envelope, her hands shaking. Elijah and Micah stepped off the plane, flanked by their father. The hush behind them was deafening. Passengers parted without being asked. A few murmured soft, "Excuse me." Others watched in awe, some in shame, a few in understanding. Back in the galley, Evelyn Rhodes stood silently, her eyes never leaving the family as they exited. She said nothing, but as Veronica walked past, she whispered just loud enough, "Power has a seat number 2. You just didn't know it today." Veronica didn't answer. She couldn't. 30 minutes later, in the executive boardroom at the airline's terminal headquarters, Veronica sat in a cold leather chair across from a long glass table. On the far end sat 3 corporate executives, the HR director, and a silent observer from the DEI Council. A screen behind them showed a paused still from the cabin security footage. Veronica could barely look at it. 2 boys, 2 seats, her face twisted in confrontation, captured forever. Back at the hotel suite, Elijah sat by the window overlooking the New York skyline. Micah lay sprawled across the couch, phone in hand, laughing softly. Leon entered, loosening his tie. "How are my future lawyers?" "More like future CEO and COO, Micah teased. Leon smirked, then sat beside them. "What happened today won't go away quietly, but how did you handle it?" "That spoke louder than anything I could have done." Elijah nodded slowly. "She didn't expect us to have a voice." "No," Leon said. "She didn't expect us to know how to use it." By the time the sun began to slip beneath the Manhattan skyline, the story had already leapt from the confined hush of first class into the roaring noise of the world. It started with a whisper, a grainy cell phone video taken by a businessman in seat 4A who had pretended not to notice. The clip, barely 30 seconds long, showed Elijah and Micah Thompson being led down the aisle, their faces composed, their silence louder than any protest. But the caption beneath it? That's what cracked the sky open. 2 black teens kicked out of first class. Guess what? Their dad owns the airline. The tweet went viral in under 15 minutes. By midnight, the video had racked up 4.2 million views. By dawn, Veronica Steele's name was trending worldwide. Inside the offices of Harrington International Airways, the tension was like a coiled spring. Senior executives rushed between departments, PR consultants whispered in corners, and crisis managers lined conference room walls like chess pieces waiting to be moved. Leon Thompson, however, remained still. He sat at the head of the boardroom table, sleeves rolled, phone face down, coffee gone cold. His sons had been humiliated. The world had seen it, but he wasn't here to retaliate. He was here to restructure. "Damage report," he said simply. Melissa Grant, VP of Human Resources, cleared her throat. Over 9,000 customer complaints were logged in 12 hours. Our call centers are overwhelmed. We're trending on every platform. Investor confidence dropped 7.4% overnight. We've had 3 board members request an emergency audit on crew training compliance. Leon absorbed the numbers like a surgeon reviewing scans, concerned but never rattled. Then he turned to the man beside him. "Tell me about the footage," he said. Nathan Cole, head of internal compliance, opened a laptop. The image of Veronica Steele confronting Elijah and Micah filled the screen. "No audio, just motion." "This was pulled from cabin surveillance," he explained. "As you can see, she approached them without verifying tickets. No attempt to contact the gate, no manifest check." Leon stared at the image for a long moment, then nodded once. "Schedule the staff-wide town hall. 48 hours from now. I want the entire airline workforce on that call, from janitors to jet pilots." Melissa blinked. "What for?" Leon didn't hesitate. "To witness what happens when silence gets comfortable, and we stop holding ourselves accountable." Meanwhile, in their hotel suite overlooking Central Park, Elijah and Micah sat side by side at a marble-top table. The city buzzed below them. Horns, voices, sirens. The world is always moving. But up here, things were different. Micah stared at his phone, jaw slack. "Bro, there are kids at my school reposting the video with captions like, 'Don't mess with Thompson blood.' Even Coach Garvey shared it with a fist emoji." Elijah didn't respond at first. He was watching the video too again. "It's surreal," he finally said. Micah leaned in. "I think what you said hit people." "I didn't say anything." "You didn't have to." Back at Harrington HQ, Veronica Steele stood alone in a cold, windowless room with Olivia Marks, the director of ethical conduct. Her uniform had been returned. Her badges disabled. What remained now was her statement. You've served 22 years, Olivia began. You've trained new hires, led international routes, never received a major complaint. Veronica nodded silently. So what happened, Miss R. Steele? Veronica swallowed hard. I saw two teenagers in first class. No adults nearby. They were quiet, calm. I assumed. I've seen stunts before. Sneak-ins, mistaken seat numbers. Olivia didn't blink. So what made these two different? Veronica's voice cracked. They were black. Silence, long and uncomfortable. I didn't want it to be about that, she added, desperate now. But in hindsight, yes, it was. Olivia closed her folder. The truth is hard, but it matters. The question is, do you understand the harm you caused? Veronica didn't answer right away. Her face, once sharp with control, was soft now, tired, haunted. I thought I was protecting the cabin's integrity. Turns out I was tearing it apart. In an entirely different corner of New York, a press conference was underway. Reporters gathered outside Harrington's Midtown office. Cameras clicked. Microphones were hoisted like spears. Leon Thompson stood at the podium, not as a CEO defending his brand, but as a father defending a principle. This is not about my sons, he said, voice calm but unshakable. This is about the countless other passengers who experience quiet discrimination every day and walk away with no camera, no viral video, no father in a boardroom to speak for them. He paused. We will not settle for a statement or a suspension. We will reform from within. Training will change. Accountability will be public. This is no longer about correcting an incident. It's about correcting a culture. The flash of cameras exploded like lightning, but he didn't flinch. Back at the hotel, Elijah opened his email. A new message had arrived from a name he didn't recognize. Subject, thank you. My son was taken off a plane last year for not looking like a priority passenger. I was too afraid to speak. Watching you and your brother hold your ground, you didn't just reclaim your seats, you gave us all a voice. Thank you. He stared at it for a long while before hitting reply. You're not alone. We see you. That evening, Evelyn Rhodes, the quiet flight attendant who had witnessed the entire episode unfold in real time, sat alone in her small apartment. A soft glow from the TV flickered across her face. The screen played Leon's press conference replay. She watched him speak, watched the calm fire in his eyes, and she made a decision. She opened her laptop, logged into the internal portal, and began writing her own report. Not just on Veronica, but on the silent culture that had allowed moments like this to go unchecked. When she clicked submit, she didn't tremble. She felt whole. Later that night, Elijah and Micah stood at the balcony, the wind brushing their faces, the city blinking below like a living constellation. You think things change? Micah asked softly. Elijah thought for a moment. Maybe not all at once, but one truth, when said out loud, can echo for a long time. Micah nodded. I hope they hear it. Elijah turned to him. They did. At 8:02 a.m., the inboxes of over 11,000 Harrington International Airways employees lit up with the same subject line. Mandatory Town Hall, 10:01 a.m. EST, attendance required. There was no explanation, no agenda, no warning, but everyone already knew what it was about. The fallout from Flight 3096, now dubbed the first-class incident, had scorched the media landscape. Overnight, Harrington's brand had transformed from a symbol of elite air travel to a lightning rod for conversations about racial bias in service culture. Commentators on cable news dissected it with the intensity of a courtroom trial. Social media threads dug deeper into past complaints. And the public wasn't just watching, they were demanding answers. But behind the PR crisis and public statements, something quieter and far more dangerous was happening inside the company. People were beginning to talk. Evelyn Rhodes sat alone in the crew break room at JFK's Terminal 4, a paper cup of lukewarm coffee in her hands. The small wall-mounted screen above her head counted down the time until the town hall began. She had never intended to be part of a movement. She was 27, quiet, steady, the kind of employee who kept her head down, did the job, and kept her observations to herself. But something inside her shifted after watching Veronica Steele humiliate Elijah and Micah. Not just because it was wrong, but because it had always been there. I thought I was the only one who noticed, she had told herself 100 times. Until now. Across the city in Harrington's headquarters, Leon Thompson entered the executive conference suite dressed in a navy blue button-down and slacks. No tie, no blazer, no fanfare. He didn't need it. Every face in the room, department heads, division leaders, legal counsel, straightened when he entered. He nodded once, acknowledging their presence, then moved to the front of the camera, where a glowing red light signaled that 11,000 people across the country were now watching. The town hall began. "Good morning," Leon said, his tone even but weighty. "What happened on Flight 3096 is not just an incident, it is a symptom, a warning, and a mirror. Today, we stop treating stories like this as isolated events and start asking ourselves why they keep happening." He paused, his hands resting gently on the glass lectern. "I'm not here today as your CEO. I'm here as a father who watched his children be publicly questioned for simply existing where they belonged. And I'm here as a man who built a company on the belief that dignity is non-negotiable." Across dozens of terminals, cockpits, crew lounges, and home offices, employees leaned forward. In the JFK break room, Evelyn whispered, "He's not reading off a script." She wasn't alone anymore. Sitting beside her was Diego Martinez, a mechanic who had filed a discrimination complaint 2 years ago, silenced with a verbal clarification. Across from him, Tara Nguyen, a check-in agent, nodded slowly. "He means it." Evelyn took a breath and opened her laptop. She began typing. Subject: Internal Culture Review, Personal Account, to ethics@harringtonair.com. Body: I was on Flight 3096. I watched what happened, and I want to tell you what I've seen in my time here. Because this wasn't the first time someone was treated like they didn't belong. She hovered over send, then clicked. The sound was soft, but it echoed in her chest like thunder. Back on the live stream, Leon continued. "I've instructed our ethics department to open a direct channel for any current or former employee who has experienced or witnessed discrimination inside this company. Every report will be reviewed. Anonymity will be respected. And for the first time, they will not be buried." Gasps whispered through the executive wing. Some glanced nervously at each other. Others, like Melissa Grant, the VP of HR, looked straight ahead. She knew what was coming. Leon wasn't going to patch the leak. He was about to rebuild the pipeline. In Charlotte, a retired pilot named Carla Simmons, watching from home, sat upright in her recliner. She had walked away from the company 5 years earlier, frustrated after her repeated concerns about biased promotion practices were ignored. She reached for her tablet. To ethics@harringtonair.com. Subject: Former Captain. Statement. Her fingers moved fast. By 10:38 a.m., over 2,100 reports had flooded the inbox. Stories from gate agents, baggage handlers, flight attendants, junior execs. Each one was a crack in the wall that had hidden these truths for years. Back at the suite, Micah was on the couch watching the live stream on his tablet. Elijah stood by the window, arms crossed, his reflection mingling with the skyline. "You think Dad's ready for what's coming?" Micah asked. Elijah nodded. "I think the company's not." At 10:43 a.m., the first anonymous leak hit the press, a document marked confidential, listing over 24 closed bias complaints that had never been escalated beyond mid-management. The publication timestamp, 5 minutes after Leon's town hall opened the gates. News outlets pounced. By lunchtime, We Fly Equal was trending globally. Inside the chaos, one face remained invisible to the world. Veronica Steele. She sat in her apartment, the blinds drawn, the curtains shut. Her phone buzzed every hour. Calls, missed messages, emails from friends who didn't know what to say, and those who said far too much. Her name had become synonymous with the system's failure. And yet she wasn't the system. She had simply acted on it, repeated it, embodying what had always been there. But now the system had turned its gaze inward, and it was finding more Veronicas than anyone wanted to admit. At 3:12 p.m., Evelyn's phone buzzed. An internal memo had been sent to all crew members. Subject: Interim Reform Committee. Message: effective immediately, Harrington International Airways is forming a volunteer advisory board made up of current frontline employees to assist in equity policy redesign. If you believe in change and wish to contribute, submit your name. Evelyn stared at it. A week ago, she would have archived the message without reading it twice. Now, she stood up, heart steady, and clicked apply. She entered her name, then typed, "I was there. I'm ready to help fix it." The next morning, Evelyn Rhodes awoke to something she hadn't felt in years: purpose, a quiet, focused hum that steadied her hands and sharpened her thoughts. By 8 a.m., she had already ironed her Navy uniform, packed her tote, and reviewed the company's new interim policy draft in the crew portal twice. She wasn't just boarding a flight today. She was stepping into something bigger than herself. Because yesterday afternoon, her application to the Equity Reform Advisory Board had been accepted, and she was no longer just Evelyn, the junior flight attendant. She was now the face of the frontline reform movement. The employee portal was buzzing, hundreds of comments under the internal bulletin post. Finally, someone who gets it. "I've flown with Evelyn. She's the real deal. If she's in, I'm hopeful." But not every comment was supportive. Buried beneath the praise were colder lines. "So now every service interaction will be a lawsuit?" "Not everyone with a bad attitude is a victim. Be careful, she's becoming dangerous." And one anonymous post that was removed within 10 minutes but had already been screenshotted and shared. When people like Evelyn take control, we lose what made this airline efficient. The lines were being drawn. At the same time, in a private conference room in Harrington headquarters, a very different conversation was unfolding. Seated around the polished table were 7 mid-level executives, most of them men in tailored suits. At the head of the table sat Richard Avery, Senior Director of Operations. He was in his early 50s, with steely gray temples and a voice that rarely rose above a whisper, but when he spoke, people listened. He stared at the headline on his laptop screen. "Meet Evelyn Rhodes, the flight attendant leading Harrington's cultural reckoning." Richard shut the screen slowly. "This is getting out of control." One of his deputies, Sandra Lee, leaned forward. "It's moving fast, sir. Too fast. We've had 4 managers resign this morning, 1 from regional, 3 from customer relations." "Because they know what's coming," Richard replied. "Files, testimonies, exposure." "And Evelyn?" Sandra asked. Richard's lips thinned. "She's the fuse." Back at JFK, Evelyn boarded Flight 482 to Chicago with her head high and her eyes alert. But something had shifted. The usual warm glances from older crew members were now a mix of curiosity and caution. She caught whispers, a second too long stare from the lead flight attendant, a clipped tone from a gate agent who had once asked her for career advice. Change had a scent, and to some, it smelled like a threat. As she prepped the beverage cart, she felt someone approach from behind. Carmen, a senior flight attendant with 18 years of service and a reputation for efficiency over empathy, crossed her arms. "Busy week for you," she said coolly. Evelyn nodded. "It's been full." "I heard you're on the reform board," Carmen added, voice flat. "I am." Carmen looked her over. "Be careful. This place doesn't like being shaken. It pretends to, until the shaking starts affecting the brand." Then she walked away. Later in the cockpit before departure, the co-pilot turned to the captain. "Is she the one?" he asked, nodding toward the cabin. The captain didn't look up from his checklist. "Rhodes? Yep." "What do you think?" "I think she's got guts, and that scares the hell out of some people." Meanwhile, in a quiet hallway at Harrington HQ, Leon Thompson walked side by side with Melissa Grant. "She's doing well," Melissa said, referring to Evelyn. "Her file is spotless. I reviewed it myself. Great evaluations. No red flags." Leon nodded. "She's our litmus test. If the company treats her fairly now, it sends a message to everyone else, both those who are hopeful and those who are hiding." Melissa paused. "There's already pushback. Internal emails, coordinated silence. Some managers are banding together. I have a name for you." Leon stopped walking. "Richard Avery." Leon's eyes narrowed slightly. "I expected as much." Later that afternoon, Evelyn entered the first closed session of the Equity Reform Advisory Board via video call. The virtual table was full, 12 representatives across departments, flight attendants, ground staff, mechanics, baggage handlers, and 2 gate agents. Some faces were eager, some hesitant, but one thing was clear. They were all waiting for someone to start. Evelyn took a breath. "I don't have all the answers," she began, "but I was there. And I've been here long enough to know that what happened on that flight didn't start with Veronica Steele. And it won't end with her." A few heads nodded. One face smiled. "It ends when we stop confusing silence with loyalty," she continued. "And when we stop believing that efficiency is more important than dignity." The call was silent for a second. Then someone unmuted. "Thank you." That evening, an encrypted email was sent from a private account inside Harrington's management network. Subject: control the narrative. If we let Evelyn's message define the company, we lose the structure we've built. We need to protect operational integrity before this turns into a witch hunt. The recipient list was limited, but the intention was clear. Undermine the movement, slowly, quietly, from within. By the next day, Evelyn received a new flight schedule. 12 hours of back-to-back assignments, minimum layovers, and last-minute route changes. She stared at the screen. "Sabotage," she whispered. Back at headquarters, Leon reviewed the same schedule, sent to him confidentially by Melissa. He tapped his pen. "Richard's testing us." Melissa didn't flinch. "He thinks you won't risk shaking senior management." Leon looked out the window. "I don't need to shake them," he said. "I need to replace them." The sky above Dallas shimmered with heat waves as Flight 2197 taxied toward Gate A17. Inside the aircraft, Evelyn Rhodes pushed the beverage cart through first class with the poise of someone trained to smile even while burning. But today, her hands were tired. This was her 3rd consecutive long-haul flight in 2 days. Her layover had been 4 hours, barely enough time to eat, shower, and rest her swollen ankles. And though no one had said it outright, she knew what was happening. They were trying to wear her down. When she returned to the galley, Andre, a fellow flight attendant, leaned in. "You good?" he asked quietly. Evelyn nodded without making eye contact. "Just tired." Andre hesitated, then slipped her a folded note, palmed discreetly like contraband. "Be careful. Someone in scheduling is altering your roster manually. Word is it came from ops leadership. I thought you should know." Evelyn's stomach turned. So it wasn't paranoia. It was a hit job in slow motion. Back in New York, Richard Avery was watching everything unfold with calculated precision. He stood before a wall-length digital board displaying internal analytics, employee sentiment scores, scheduling flowcharts, and complaint queues. But the metric he was most interested in glowed red. Rhodes' Visibility Index, 92%, highest among all flight attendants. Too visible, too influential. "She's become more than a worker," Richard muttered to himself. "She's become a symbol, and symbols have to be neutralized." He opened a folder marked Compliance Anomalies, Evelyn Rhodes, and began typing. Later that afternoon, Evelyn arrived at her crew hotel and collapsed on the bed, shoes still on. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Melissa Grant. "Urgent. Need to speak. Private line. 6 p.m. Come alone. No digital trail." Evelyn's heart raced. She sat up, pulse pounding. This wasn't just about fatigue anymore. This was a warning. At exactly 6 p.m., Evelyn arrived at a discreet cafe near Love Field Airport. Melissa Grant sat in a booth near the back, wearing sunglasses despite the dim light. She waved Evelyn over. "Thanks for coming," Melissa said softly. "I had to do this off record." Evelyn sat down slowly. "What's going on?" Melissa pulled a small envelope from her purse. Inside were 4 printed pages, internal logs from the scheduling department, each one marked with red annotations, showing manual overrides, reroutes, and approvals tied to one name. Avery Richard. "He's targeting you," Melissa said, "pushing you into fatigue violations, hoping you'll either make a mistake or quit. If you do either, they'll label you unstable." Evelyn's jaw clenched. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I used to believe in the same system he built," Melissa said quietly, "until I saw how many of us it swallowed." Evelyn looked down at the papers. What do I do? Melissa leaned in. Hold on until the right time. We're not done yet. There's a woman, a former manager. She's coming forward with something, and it changes everything. 2 states away, in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Atlanta, Julia Knox sat alone with a flash drive in her palm. Her hands shook. For 7 years, she had worked in customer relations escalations at Harrington International. Her job was to filter complaints, to decide which ones got forwarded to legal and which ones disappeared. And she had kept a copy, every email, every case that had been dismissed due to lack of corroboration, even when the evidence was overwhelming. The top of the archive folder on her drive read, Classified, Racial Complaint Suppressions, 2017-2024. There were 83 cases, names, dates, flight numbers, audio recordings. Most were black passengers, many were children, some were even disabled, and most disturbingly, 7 were flagged with "Do Not Escalate" tags, personally signed off by Richard Avery. The next morning, Julia walked into a quiet law office on Peachtree Street. She didn't bring a lawyer of her own. She brought the truth. The civil rights firm, Hendricks, Lowell and Price, had been waiting. Within hours, the documents were verified, indexed, and secured in a litigation vault. An emergency filing was prepared. A class action lawsuit was drafted. And Julia, once afraid of losing her severance and silence clause, had signed a whistleblower immunity agreement under federal protection. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat on a jump seat, exhausted, her mind spinning. She had been running on instinct, duty, and pure adrenaline. But now, the tide was shifting. She opened her email. A subject line caught her eye. "Thank you for being first. From a fellow fighter." She clicked it. Inside was a brief message. "My name is Julia Knox. I used to work for the system you're trying to fix, and I've just lit a match underneath it. What comes next? We'll need you." Attached was a redacted preview of the complaint list. One line stood out. Case 44, Harrington vs. Passenger Elijah Thompson, suppressed 2020. Elijah, Evelyn froze. They had done this before. To him, to others, and it had been buried. Until now. That night at Harrington headquarters, Leon Thompson stared at the files Melissa had just handed him. He was a man who had built empires with composure, but tonight he slammed his fist against the desk. "They knew. For years." Melissa nodded. "Julia has everything. It's airtight." Leon straightened. "Then we don't wait. We call the press. We release our findings. We show the world we're not cleaning house because we were caught. We're doing it because it's right." He paused. "And Evelyn? She's holding." Leon stared at the city lights. "She won't hold alone much longer." It happened at 7:36 a.m. on a crisp Friday morning. The homepage of the New York Sentinel, one of the country's most trusted investigative outlets, flashed a headline in bold black type. Exclusive. Whistleblower reveals Harrington Airlines suppressed 83 racial discrimination cases, 7 personally blocked by executive. Beneath it, a subheading struck harder. "They thought we wouldn't speak. How one woman's file and another's courage are about to change everything." And just like that, the story exploded. By 9 a.m., Evelyn Rhodes' phone was melting. Her crew schedule had been suspended. Her email flooded. Her face now appeared on social media beside hashtags like "Kirshaks we fly equal," "Turn our justice in the skies." "Enan," Evelyn spoke. She hadn't asked for this spotlight, but the world had turned it on her anyway. She watched in stunned silence as the article unfurled on her tablet. Photos, documents, redacted complaint lists, verified audio recordings. Julia Knox's voice explaining how she was instructed to filter for risk, not truth. And there, halfway down the page, was a name she recognized. Case 44, Elijah Thompson, age 14, accused of fare evasion on first-class boarding. The investigation dropped after surveillance proved he had a correct ticket. Internal review recommended an apology. Status, suppressed, executive sign-off, R. Avery. Evelyn's hands trembled. They had done this to him before, when he was just a boy, and now he had returned as a young man, quiet, composed, and had been humiliated again. Across town in Harrington HQ's 24th floor crisis response suite, Leon Thompson stood like stone, arms crossed, flanked by his legal team. On the monitor before him, journalists shouted questions at a press conference he hadn't yet entered. Beside him, Melissa Grant lowered her phone. CNN, MSNBC, BBC, they've all requested interviews. Decline them all, Leon replied. Melissa hesitated. Why? He turned, jaw tight. Because this isn't about me anymore. It never should have been. He pointed to a different screen, one that showed Evelyn Rhodes boarding flight 2197 just days ago. She's the face, the voice, not corporate, real, human, unfiltered. At that exact moment, Richard Avery was spiraling. Inside his executive suite, curtains drawn, the office sealed off from staff, he tore through folders, deleting files from personal drives, placing calls no one was answering. Get me legal, get me PR, he hissed into the phone. But it was too late. The files were authenticated. The signatures were verifiable. The damage was irreversible. On his screen, he saw it. His name, his sign-off, his decisions, public, everywhere. And worst of all, he knew what came next. The board would demand his head, unless he gave them a distraction. At 11:42 a.m., an email quietly leaked to select journalists under an anonymous source claiming insider knowledge. Subject, Evelyn Rhodes' record, not as clean as it seems. Attachment, unverified flight incident memo, March 2021. Allegation, passenger dispute, professionalism concerns, crew friction. Within 30 minutes, the email made its way to media outlets. By noon, a tabloid site had already posted, "New darling of the reform movement may have a troubled past." The article was short, vague, based on an anonymous memo, but it did the trick. Suddenly, the tide of support for Evelyn met its first wall of manufactured doubt. At a small cafe in Brooklyn, Evelyn sat frozen, her laptop open to the headline. She stared at the words like they were knives. The incident they referred to? She remembered it. A passenger had shoved a crew member and cursed at her after being denied an upgrade. Evelyn had stepped in to de-escalate. She'd raised her voice, not yelled, asserted, and she'd written a full report afterward. The so-called incident memo? It wasn't even disciplinary. It was fabricated from thin threads. Her phone rang. It was Melissa. "They're coming for you now," Melissa said, breath clipped. "Avery's behind it. But we're ready." "I don't want to be a symbol," Evelyn whispered. Melissa paused. "That's the thing about symbols, Evelyn. You don't choose them. The truth does." By 3 p.m., the airline board had convened a private emergency session. Julia Knox had been flown in under security escort to testify. So had Elijah Thompson, at his father's request. In the long glass conference room, silence reigned. Julia sat upright, the whistleblower documents before her. Elijah stood next to her, tall, calm, 17 now, but with eyes that carried more years than they should. He placed one item on the table, his first-class ticket from Flight 3096. Then he spoke. "This isn't just about what happened last week. It's about what's been happening for years. You can replace a few seats. You can suspend a few names. But if you don't change what happens when nobody's watching, you haven't fixed anything." His words cut deeper than any memo. Because they weren't spoken from policy, they came from pain. By 4:30 p.m., the board had voted. Richard Avery, terminated. Board directive, public transparency audit, special assignment, Evelyn Rhodes to lead frontline ethics reform, reporting directly to Leon Thompson. Outside the headquarters, a swarm of media awaited an update. Leon Thompson stepped to the podium and gave the statement that would be replayed around the world. Today, this company faced a reckoning, not just for what was done, but for what was ignored. One woman risked her career to protect the truth. Another came forward to reveal what had been buried. And my sons reminded all of us what dignity looks like under pressure. He paused. We are not burying this story with a PR line. We're building a new one, with Evelyn Rhodes at the helm. Reporters fired questions, but Leon stepped aside and Evelyn took the mic. She didn't have a speech. She didn't have a script, only her voice. "I'm not here because I'm perfect. I'm here because I stayed when others looked away. Because it wasn't just about one flight or two passengers. It was about a pattern. That pattern ends today. Not because we fixed everything, but because now you're all watching. 6 weeks later, the wind was brisk at JFK, brushing against the freshly printed banner above Gate 9. Welcome aboard, Flight 501, the future of fair skies. Beneath it stood a new generation of cabin crew, lined up with quiet pride. Their uniforms were crisp, their posture confident, not because they were perfect, but because they had trained under a brand new program called the Rhodes Standard. Named for her, built from her voice. And today, Evelyn Rhodes would be boarding the inaugural flight as a senior lead, not just in rank, but in purpose. She walked through the glass jet bridge like she had hundreds of times before, but everything had changed. Her crew wore pins shaped like open wings, a symbol introduced under the Reform Initiative, representing transparency, accountability, and courage. Behind her, two DEI observers discreetly noted procedures. Ahead, a small sign posted near the cabin entrance read, "Every seat holds equal dignity. Every voice deserves to be heard." Evelyn placed her palm on the sign gently before walking in. Across the country, in a high school classroom in Atlanta, Micah Thompson glanced up at the TV in the corner. His AP government teacher had paused the lesson. She turned the volume up. And in today's aviation milestone, Harrington International launches Flight 501, the first major commercial flight trained under a new federal initiative called Clear Skies. Inspired in part by two teens whose quiet courage captured the country's attention. Micah didn't smile. He just looked down, pulled out a notebook, and wrote a single line across the top. "We belong there, and now everyone will." In another part of the city, Elijah Thompson stood outside their school library, hands in his pockets. He had been quiet lately. They embraced. "Look what we did," Julia whispered. Evelyn smiled. "Look what we started." Later that evening, in the calm silence of her apartment, Evelyn sat beside her window and opened a letter that had arrived by hand. It was from Leon Thompson. "Evelyn, I believe in symbols, not because they're loud, but because they survive fire. You didn't ask to be one. You just kept showing up. So did the truth. Let's keep building." LT. Inside was a lapel pin, gold, shaped like a seat number plaque. It read, "No one, respect." She placed it on her desk. A week later, at Harrington High School, a ceremony was held. A scholarship was introduced, the Elijah and Micah Thompson Honor Seat Award, funding full aviation or leadership training for students of color who demonstrate quiet courage and community spirit. Micah nudged Elijah as the name was read. "This is insane," he whispered. Elijah smiled faintly. "Feels about right." That night, Leon stood in the family library, placing a framed photo of Evelyn, Julia, Elijah, and Micah on a shelf. Next to it, he added an old ticket stub, Flight 3096. He stepped back and whispered, "Every movement has its moment." Ours began in silence, but it landed in history. Moral of the story: silence is not always submission. Sometimes it's a storm gathering strength. Racism doesn't always arrive with slurs. Sometimes it shows up with polite suspicion, with denial dressed as procedure, with power hiding behind protocol. But injustice, no matter how quietly it enters, leaves a mess loud enough for the world to hear. In this story, justice didn't come from a courtroom. It came from voices that refused to stay quiet, from a flight attendant who remembered her humanity, from a whistleblower who opened the vault, from two young boys who never raised their voices but held their dignity. We don't defeat broken systems with rage alone. We change them by refusing to be silent in front of small wrongs. Because those small wrongs, left unchecked, become culture. And culture, once challenged, can finally be rewritten. One seat at a time, one name at a time, one story at a time.